Hello, I am Steve Huffner, a law professor at The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law and the Deputy Director of the Election Law Program here at Ohio State. We are delighted to welcome you to this conversation today about alternative election systems and their potential impact on the health and durability of our democracy. We've titled our program An Electoral Game-Changer: What if Ohio and other states used Alaska's new ranked choice voting system? And we are happy to have four guests with us to explore this topic. I'm going to briefly introduce all four of our panelists right now, and then provide a brief overview of our topic myself before turning some time over to each of these four panelists. In the order in which they will offer some opening remarks, I'm very pleased to introduce first James Brooks. James has been the state reporter for the Anchorage Daily News, Alaska's main newspaper, for the past 3.5 years. Based in Juneau, he covers state government, the Alaska legislature, and other capital city assignments for the Anchorage Daily News. For a full decade prior to that, he reported and edited for the Juneau Empire, the Kodiak Daily Mirror, and the Fairbanks Daily News Minor. And he's a double major in English and history. After James talks us through some of the Alaska details, Julie Carr-Smythe will next talk to us about Ohio. Julie is an award-winning journalist, political commentator, and history geek who covers government, politics, and all things Ohio. Today, she is an Associated Press correspondent here in Columbus. She's a native Ohioan and an OSU graduate, earning both her bachelor's and master's in journalism here at Ohio State. And after an early journalism career in New York and Florida, she returned to Ohio more than 2 decades ago to cover state politics and government, first for the Cleveland Plain Dealer before moving to the Associated Press. We'll then be able to hear from Michael Parsons. Michael is a senior legal fellow at Fair Vote. Fair Vote is a nonpartisan organization with a 30-year history of promoting better election processes and voting reforms to make democracy more functional and representative for every American. At Fair Vote, Michael provides policy guidance and legal advice in connection with state and federal legislation, election litigation, and enforcement practices, as well as collaborating with other voting rights and election reform organizations. He is also an affiliate scholar at the NYU School of Law, where he studies and writes about political representation. And he's a practicing lawyer who received his law degree from Georgetown University and clerked for a federal district court and for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit before beginning his career as a practicing lawyer. And then finally, Lisa Marshall-Manheim is the Charles I. Stone Professor of Law at the University of Washington School of Law. Lisa writes in the areas of constitutional law, election law, and presidential powers, with scholarship having been published in a variety of leading academic journals. She teaches courses that include constitutional law, election law, legislation, and federal courts. She's a 3-time recipient of the Professor of the Year Award given by the students at the University of Washington. She earned her JD from Yale Law School and also practiced for several years before joining the faculty at the University of Washington, and clerked for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit and for Justice Anthony Kennedy on the U.S. Supreme Court. So we're really pleased to have all four of you and look forward to hearing from you. Now I'm going to offer a brief overview of our topic. Here in Ohio, we are less than 1 week away from our primary election for our 1 U.S. Senate seat that is open this year, as well as for our 15 congressional seats. The federal election in Ohio this year will proceed along what we might call the conventional route, and I want to just take a minute to just walk through what I mean by the conventional route and compare that briefly to what's going on in Alaska this year. And I'm going to see if I can share my screen to do this with you. What I'd like to do is just, as I said, make a few comparisons between the Ohio system and the Alaska system. So the Ohio conventional system means we have a primary next Tuesday for our congressional races and for the U.S. Senate seat. That conventional primary election will include a Democratic primary and a Republican primary, where voters will vote in the primary of their political party. Now, they're allowed to pick that party on primary day, but they will pick one or the other or stay with whichever party they previously designated. And then they will vote for one candidate per race in the primary election. And the top vote getter from each of those partisan primaries, even if they have not received over 50% of the vote, will go on to the general election. Contrast that with Alaska's top four system this year. Alaska's top four primary will occur not till mid-August, so there's still 3 more months of campaigning for that. But when that top four primary occurs, it will be one nonpartisan event where all voters will participate in the same single primary election. They will also be voting for one candidate per office or per race, but then the top four vote getters from each race will go on to the general election. These differences in the primary structure do mean that the general election itself will also be different. So in the Ohio or conventional system, we will have a Democratic nominee, a Republican nominee, and then any candidates who are eligible as independents through a petition process who are also on the ballot. And then the voters will vote for one candidate for each seat or office or race. And then the winner will be the candidate who receives the most votes, even if that is not over 50%. That's what we call a plurality winner, the conventional system in use in most states today. In Alaska, in contrast, we take the top four candidates from this unitary primary, regardless of their party, as well as any official write-in candidates who are eligible to be considered in the general election. And then the voters will be able to rank up to 5 candidates. So I can show you just really quickly what that ranked ballot might look like. So here is a mock-up of a ranked choice ballot, for instance, where each voter is able to identify not only their first choice, but in this example, up to 5 choices, because there's a possibility of a write-in as well. And then the winner is the candidate, if there is one, who has received over 50% of the votes when the first choice votes are tabulated. But if there is no one who's received 50% of the first place votes in the initial tabulation, then we use an instant runoff process, which reassigns the votes of the voters whose first choice candidate has come in last. And those candidates, that last place candidate is eliminated, the votes of those voters for other candidates are redistributed, and we see if by then we have a candidate who's received 50% of the vote. If we still don't have a candidate with 50% of the vote, we repeat that process of eliminating the candidate who at that point has received the fewest votes, for fewest remaining first place votes, and so on until we have a 50% winner. So with that background, which I hope was helpful in contrasting the conventional system with the Alaska system, I'm going to turn now first to James Brooks and invite him to tell us a little bit more about this new electoral system and how it is altering the dynamics of the race there in Alaska. James.
Good morning, everyone. I've got a few slides to share with you. If Steve can disable his screen sharing, I can use mine here and bring this up here shortly. There we go. Okay, that should be showing up for everyone. As you all know, Alaska is large, and in this case, the physical geography of Alaska affects the political geography, because while Alaska is geographically large, its population is extremely small. It's concentrated in the largest city, Anchorage, which has about 1/3 of the population. The Fairbanks and the suburban Matanuska-Susitna borough, because Alaska has boroughs instead of counties. There's some functional differences, but for the purposes of this, you can think of boroughs and counties. If I use boroughs, just think of it as a county. It has about 200,000 people. The Juneau, where I live, the state capital, is the 3rd largest city. It has about 30,000 people. So that gives you an idea of the geography here. The state has about 550,000 people who are 18 or older and theoretically eligible to vote. If you subtract international residents, people who are not US citizens, convicted felons who are not eligible to vote, it becomes about 525,000 people. But the state does have significantly more registered voters. There's a large population of people who live out of state but are still registered in Alaska. In the 2020 general election, about 10% of the votes cast in that election came from people living out of state but voting in Alaska. What sets Alaska also apart is the party registration. While about 24% of voters are registered Republicans, the biggest segment, more than half of voters, are either nonpartisan or undeclared voters, effectively independent. Now, I should say that there are, that when it comes to the 2020 election results, there are limits to that independence. The state still leans Republican. More than half of votes went for President Donald Trump, went for Republican US Senate candidate Dan Sullivan, and Republican US House candidate Don Young. When it came for the vote on ballot measure 2, the measure that installed ranked choice voting and the universal primary, the top 4 primary, that was opposed by a predominantly Republican but mixed group of people. The opposition wasn't particularly organized. The proponents were organized and spent a great deal of money, and the result was a narrow victory for ballot measure 2 and this new system that we'll be using in 2022. The Alaska Senate and Alaska House, how they stand today. The Senate is Republican controlled with a 14-member majority. There's only 20 people in the Senate, 40 people in the House. It's the smallest legislature in the country. The House is and has been controlled by a coalition of Republicans, just 2 now, 15 Democrats and 4 independents, and 19 Republicans in the minority. And this, we don't know yet how that'll change with this new system, but what we've seen so far is the party's response to this has been interesting. The parties, because it's an open primary and candidates, regardless of party, advance, we've seen parties try to distinguish their preferred candidates. For example, the Republican state convention just happened last week, and it was effectively convention nominations for a preferred candidate or candidates in this case. In the case of the special US House election, which will be taking place before the regular election, there were multiple candidates nominated and confirmed as preferred Republican nominees. That matters because the Division of Elections will be printing candidates and their party registration rather than saying they're the Republican nominee or Democratic nominee. The division will just say this person is a registered Republican, registered Democrat, and so on. And so the parties are, at least the Republican Party, is trying to distinguish one or more Republicans in an effort to support them and avoid other Republicans whom they may not prefer. We've seen candidates come out and register for these races in unprecedented numbers so far, at least in the case of the US House race. Now, I introduce that caveat because the deadline to register for the regular election isn't until June 1st, so we don't have a total for that. But one of the things that the backers of ballot measure 2, this new system, promised during their campaign was that it would open the doors for more candidates, people who aren't necessarily party insiders, people who wouldn't run in a traditional race. In March, US Congressman Don Young died. He had been Alaska's sole representative in the House of Representatives for 49 years. A special election has been called to replace him. That election will take place June 11th, and 48 candidates have signed up to run in that race. That's an unprecedented figure.
The incumbents The incumbent senator, Republican Rob Portman, retired suddenly. He would have been favored to win re-election, of course, as an incumbent, but also we're a increasingly Republican-leaning state that was once a bellwether. So Rob Portman retired and opened up this coveted seat that's open. So the first person we saw come into the race, and Jillian, you could share my slide now, would be former Ohio Treasurer Josh Mandel. And so he hopped into the race immediately. He had a run for Senate a couple of times before, 2 or 3 times, and very instantly started collecting money and endorsements and taking a Donald Trumpian sort of approach to winning the seat. Mike Gibbons, who had also run previously for the seat and who is a Cleveland investment banker, hopped into the race. And so did Jane Timken, who many people thought at first was going to be a front runner. She was the chair of the Ohio Republican Party at that time, and so had sort of built the grassroots structure that has been traditionally thought to really get out the vote and elect Republicans that we now see controlling our government from top to bottom in terms of our state Supreme Court, both chambers of our legislature, our governor's office, and every other statewide office. She has since been endorsed by Rob Portman, and I'll get back to sort of the politics of that once I go over these candidates. J.D. Vance, who was just endorsed last week by Donald Trump, is the author of Hillbilly Elegy and has come into the race, had also added his name to the race. And as you can see, you're beginning to build up quite a number of candidates at this point sometime last year. Then we saw some interest by State Senator Matt Dolan, whose family owns the Cleveland Guardians baseball team. And he has taken a centrist kind of approach and is trying to peel off votes from the other 4 who were working on trying to secure the Trump endorsement by embracing his positions as well as his sort of methods. There has been a lot of sort of hyperbole and ugly rhetoric in the race, and a lot of tweeting and other things like that on those topics. Neil Patel and Mark Pakita have not gained a whole bunch of traction in terms of that, but as you can see, now we're looking at 7 candidates. There was an 8th, Bernie Moreno from Cleveland, another millionaire. Of these candidates, Moreno was a millionaire. Dolan has put $10 million of his own money into the race. Jane Timken has put $3.5 million. Mike Gibbons has put a whopping $17 million of his own money into the race. So that primary is super heated. But if you do the math and take a look, we have 100% of the vote. We now have 7 candidates. So well under 50% of the vote is going to win this race. With Josh Mandel being the first one in, he led polls for a long, long time, for most of last year. Mike Gibbons, with his personal wealth, began to advertise and push himself up in the ranks, come out of obscurity and begin to be noticed by voters. Timken, oddly, I mean, has stayed sort of 3rd or 4th in the polls. And so she has the endorsement of Portman, also is trying to embrace Trump. And so we have a centrist and a Trump message there, as well as her mission, her female mission. She calls it a mom on a mission, and she's trying to run also as the only woman. And so she's been 3rd, 4th in the polls at times, with Vance coming in sort of 4th, 5th-ish in the polls until last week when he was endorsed by Donald Trump and rallied with him this past Saturday. So as political reporters, we're looking at the race and thinking that with every passing week and month, somebody new is sort of in the lead. And let me just give a nod quickly to the candidates there below on the slide. The Democrats also have a competitive primary. Tim Ryan, a 10-term congressman, is running and has been viewed as sort of the front runner. Morgan Harper, a consumer finance attorney who worked in the Obama administration. There's some feeling that Tracy Johnson was recruited to sort of split that female African-American constituency so that Ryan can win that race. So that's also an interesting primary where, one candidate with or without 50% will win. The additional factor that we have going on in Ohio is that we've had a heated and protracted redistricting race or campaign, I'm sorry to say. They've been trying to draw our political maps without success. We've now had 4 rounds of legislative maps, 2 rounds of congressional maps, all of them getting declared unconstitutional, going back to our redistricting commission, et cetera. The reason that's relevant is that for many weeks, there was a question of whether this May 3rd primary next week was going to go forward. Much voter confusion. We're now seeing a scramble by everyone from the League of Women Voters to various conservative groups just trying to tell people, hey, guess what? There's an actual election happening. And so the early voting started to roll in and really was showing incredible lag, abysmal kind of turnout in terms of early voting. Frank LaRose is our Secretary of State, and the first announced votes were only 71,000 absentee ballots had been requested. That was down 40% from 4 years ago. And you're looking at potentially extremely depressed primary turnout. Now, adding, as I say, do the math, which I'm kind of doing in my head here, but 7 candidates dividing 100% of the vote, 40% turnout, and like 15 to 30% of people coming out to vote in a primary versus a general anyway. So, you're getting into really small numbers here of people who are going to decide this Republican primary in particular. A fraction of half of the population, because of course, Democrats will all vote in the Democratic primary and Republicans will vote in the Republican primary. So that splits even that depressed turnout in half, and then it's less than half again, potentially. So those are the dynamics that are at play here, which are really fascinating, and clearly ranked choice voting would play a huge role, because what we heard after the Vance endorsement by Trump from the Tea Party faction in our state was, listen, Mandel and Gibbons had been the favored candidates of the Tea Party base of Donald Trump in this state. And as a reminder, Donald Trump won the state of Ohio by more than 8 percentage points twice. So this is a huge group. They were supporting and keeping Mandel and Gibbons really close to the top of the polls. So with Vance now endorsed by him, that could potentially split those conservatives 3 ways and move Dolan or Timken into the lead. A poll just yesterday came out that had Dolan suddenly surging to the top. So it's a really interesting race and a good example to discuss today in terms of real life impacts of ranked choice voting. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike.
Thanks so much, Julie. And thank you so much to the Ohio State University for hosting this event, for inviting me. So I wanted to pick up on what Julie was talking about to discuss ranked choice voting more generally, the top 4 system from Alaska more generally, and the kinds of impacts that could have. So, I mean, just to frame things at a high level, I think we all want the same things from our election, generally speaking, which is to find candidates that reflect our values, have the broadest possible support in the electorate, so we can have faith that our elected officials, will best represent the constituents that they're elected to serve. And too often, such as in the situations that Julie was pointing out, where the vote gets split, our current systems can elect candidates who have the support of and only represent a small share of the electorate, even if those candidates might even actually be opposed by a majority of voters. So really, any election with more than two choices, ranked choice voting is more likely than plurality elections or runoff systems in general to result in fairer, more representative outcomes. And this helps by, again, ensuring candidates who run won't have to worry about the spoiler effect or even being spoilers. And so for voters, also enabling voters to, vote their conscience, vote their convictions, vote for who they really support, and not have to worry necessarily about, does this person have a shot? Do I need to vote for someone else out of electability? If someone I'm worried about looks like they might have a shot, do I need to vote for someone I don't support just to try to defeat them? Instead, you can vote for the candidate you support and then rank other candidates under that candidate, knowing that you're able to cast, again, and sort of an honest ballot. I think it's important here to distinguish actually between sort of ranked choice voting itself and Alaska's top four system. Sometimes there's also a top four final five system, because sometimes these are being conflated, and increasingly so, I think. So for example, in New York City's Democratic primary election, the primaries use ranked choice voting, and those were closed primaries, party primaries, and ranked choice voting was used to nominate each party's candidate going into the general election. And similarly, if you look to Virginia, the Republicans in Virginia used a convention process with ranked choice voting to nominate Glenn Youngkin, who then went on to win in a regular general election, right? So this is ranked choice voting being used in a closed primary system, and then a regular general election. You could also have ranked choice voting in the general election, right? Without it being a top four system. So the top four system has this sort of open jungle blanket nonpartisan primary, and then you have the top four vote getters going to the general election, and RCV is only used in the general. I think it's important to distinguish there, because some folks actually say they don't like RCV because they think it's important for the parties to be able to, control their own primaries, elect their own candidates. So what they're really saying is that they don't like the top four system. They'd prefer closed primaries, and you could use ranked choice voting in those primaries. Now, there are benefits to the top four system itself, this combination of the open primary and RCV in the general. Using RCV in the general allows this mix of perspectives when turnout is highest, when most people are at the polls. So Julie was talking about, low turnout primaries. It could be that not a lot of folks are necessarily engaged, turning out to the primary. But in a top four system, you might have, say, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats actually advance to the general. And so then you'll have the high turnout general, where people will have still the diversity of perspectives even among the parties, and can make a decision there. This is one place where some folks who favor stronger party systems actually would prefer not to have the top four system, because they don't have that ability to sort of control who is the party candidate who ends up in the general election. There are some ways to enhance party control, or give the parties a better say within top four systems. So for example, as James was talking about, in Alaska's system, it's just whoever is registered that shows up on the ballot, right? So another way you could do this is have the parties be able to have an option to designate who they've endorsed, and have that be designated on the ballot. So that is something that Fair Vote has supported, for example, to give parties a little bit more of an option to indicate who they support, as well as other things that could be helpful, such as allowing for write-ins, as Alaska does. And another best practice, I think, is if a state has, say, public funding models or has ballot access provisions that are tied to turnout, of parties or party performance to make sure that those statutes are then keyed to performance in the primary election where all candidates can compete. Since again, the general election may end up being, say, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. So if a third party, is competing and gets a fairly good measure of support in the open jungle primary, making sure that that is reflected for future ballot access or for public funding access. I am already at or past 5 minutes. So I will hold for maybe the questions and discussion. How could this maybe impact the race a little more, as well as some other implications for candidate entry, campaign strategy, voter behavior, things like that. And with that, I will hand it over to Professor Lisa Mannheim.
Thanks. And thank you also to Steve and Gillian and Ned and others at Ohio State for hosting this discussion. One of the reasons why these sorts of discussions are so important is because one of the potential effects of reforms like these is to help to ensure that the candidates that are elected consistent with these reforms are themselves committed going forward to free and fair elections. So a more direct way of saying this is that at least one of the hopes of some of the people who are advancing these sorts of reforms is to make it less likely that the people who are elected will going forward engage in election subversion. So there's a lot packed into there, but because this issue of election subversion is so important, I was hoping to spend just a bit of time kind of trying to unpack it. So first, there's not a general agreement on what exactly election subversion is. I think of it as an attempt to exploit a breakdown in the rule of law in order to install a candidate who otherwise would have lost into office. And if that's how we define election subversion, that's sort of pretty obviously inconsistent with basic principles of elections. It's incompatible with basic design of a democratic republic. And so therefore, it's a really high priority to try to prevent election subversion from happening. And to some extent, what we do in the United States is we trust that those who are in charge of elections are not going to engage in this sort of subversive activity. To that end, today's discussion is part of that sort of general set of considerations, insofar as at least one of the theories behind moving from a more traditional primary system and plurality general system into something like ranked choice voting. One of the theories behind that is that it helps to effectuate the preferences of the majority. And the majority, at least historically, has tended to be pretty committed going forward to free and fair elections. So again, I'm sort of talking about this in a little bit of a roundabout way. Another way of saying it is that one of the hopes of this sort of election reform is to make it less likely that a candidate is elected who only represents a minority of the electorate, and by extension, to make it less likely that a candidate is elected who going forward is going to try to subvert elections. Okay, so there's a few assumptions packed into that, including assumptions about what the majority of the electorate would want. What I was hoping to do, though, for the next couple minutes is to sort of, now that hopefully I've helped to explain how these sorts of reforms fit into these broader concerns over election subversion, I was hoping to quickly talk about some of the other sort of approaches that people are thinking about right now when it comes to election subversion. And by talking about that, I think it might become clearer precisely why these sorts of reforms we're talking about today are potentially so important. So if you want to try to stop election subversion, you can kind of try to do that ahead of the election by ensuring that the people who are in charge of election rules and election administration try to make sure that they are committed to free and fair elections. That's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is you can try to change the election rules to make them just harder to exploit, harder to subvert. A third thing you can do is to try to think about the possibility or the threat of election subversion and how it may be counteracted or responded to if it occurs, once it occurs. So it's sort of like thinking about this issue kind of beforehand in terms of who is empowered, thinking about it during the election, how can we have rules that are hard to exploit, and then thinking about it after the fact, how can we fix it afterward. Now, across the country, many people are thinking about reforms in all three categories. In this first category, are reforms like the ones we're talking about today. Some redistricting related reforms go to those concerns. Many are interested in figuring out how to protect election officials. They're not feeling pressure to do things that are maybe in tension with the law. So that's the first category. The second category, in terms of making rules harder to exploit, this would include efforts like those to reform something like the Electoral Count Act would fall into that category of reform. The third set of reforms, counteracting attempts at election subversion after the fact, that would go to issues surrounding, for example, sanctioning of lawyers that are bringing claims that lack merit and potentially have other problems, as well as some of the litigation surrounding the 14th Amendment and possible bars to candidacy. So each of these different types of reforms has various potential to them or various challenges, but just very briefly, what I'll say is the following. If you're gonna try to fight election subversion after the fact, of course, it may be too late at that point. If you're gonna try to change the rules of elections to fight election subversion, that might be helpful, but of course, the central problem here is that the election rules are being subverted. So it's not necessarily the case that changing the rules will stop that problem. So that backs us up to where we are today to say, you know, are there things that we can do about our election system to make it more likely that the preferences of the majority are implemented, and by extension, that we have a workable system going forward. So I think that's what I was hoping to say right here at the outset. And if I could turn it back over to Steve, that would be great.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Lisa and Michael and Julie and James. Thanks to each of you for keeping this conversation moving. There have been a few questions coming in through the Q&A feature, some with short answers that we've posted there, a couple more that we might try to pick off by talking about them. But let me ask first, before we even get to one of those questions in the Q&A, for just a little more of Julie's reflections on if we were using a top 4 primary in Ohio, who you think would be the top 4 if it were one jungle primary, as you know, Michael used the phrase. We presume that Ryan would be one of those 4, but who would be the other 3 coming out of the, you know, we presume that Vance would be one and maybe Mandel, but maybe it's hardest to figure out who the 4th one is at this point. What do you think?
Right. Well, and it does depend, you know, based on, as Mike was pointing out, if we're looking at a top 4 versus one where, you know, in some way a second and third choice could help that person. I think that there could be a lot of people who would pick, say, a Matt Dolan as their second choice. One of the things we saw in this race was that there was a physical altercation between Mandel and Gibbons that a lot of people, including Trump, the Ohio Right to Life, and others saw as disqualifying in some ways. And so whether they were tainted, I don't know. It always depends in politics how much advertising goes on at the very last minute and all that. But I would say it would probably be Ryan, Vance, Mandel, Gibbons.
Well, and of course, you're right that the question is a very different question if what we're doing is simply taking the top 4 in a plurality system as opposed to using a ranked choice, but more complicated ranked choice ballot that allows you to rank in order to generate 4 final winners, right?
Yeah, and I think that the politics of Ohio would suggest that, you know, any kind of second choice feeling that voters have would tend to be more centrist than what we've been getting lately, both in the legislature and in, you know, potentially in this race.
So let me then turn to a question in the Q&A that builds on that from one of our audience members asking if we had ranked choice voting in Ohio, could all 4 candidates who advanced to a general election be Republican? And I mean, the theoretical answer to that is yes. But I think, and Michael, I'm going to invite you to respond to this in just a second, I think ranked choice voting would be less likely to produce 4 candidates who are all Republican than maybe just a straight plurality might. But I mean, not in Ohio. In Ohio, you would still clearly get you get some from each party. But Michael, would you be interested in talking a little bit more about comparative effects on party representation between primaries themselves conducted with ranked choice versus primaries conducted with plurality, top 4, top 5?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the answer is sort of hypothetically or theoretically, right? You could have 5 Republican candidates be the ones who go to the general. In reality, it's pretty unlikely that another party wouldn't sneak in there somewhere unless you've just got an incredibly overwhelmingly Republican jurisdiction that you're working with, right? So whether it's 3 Republicans and 1 of the Democrats, or 2 Republicans, 2 of the Democrats, somebody's probably going to sort of sneak in. I saw another question in the chat about merits of top 4 versus final 5. That could be one of those, which is a little bit more space to sneak in if you're doing plurality election in the primary and then taking 4 or 5 and running ranked choice voting in the general. To Julie's point, though, I mean, if you had, say, ranked choice voting in the primary, you could have a little bit of that consolidation and eliminating of the vote splitting among the parties themselves, and then have, say, I think, the greater representatives of those parties be the ones who are showing up in the general. Typically a 4 or 5 allows for enough folks to get in that there's still a diversity of choice. You don't necessarily have to run 2 ranked choice voting elections one after another, which can introduce sort of additional complexity, things like that. I think people like the simplicity of top 4. But I mean, one of the places, to James' point about the special election and 48 candidates running, is a place where, maybe you have candidates moving into the top 4 that got 12%, 10%, 8%, and 8%, right? And you ask yourself, well, is the top 4 here, even if we run ranked choice voting against these top 4, are we getting maybe who would have been supported the most majority, the majority winner? So that might be another place where, again, having sort of RCV in the primary, RCV in the general could be helpful. But, again, it's all about sort of what works for that jurisdiction, what folks think is the best way to produce a representative candidate. And, top 4 has been getting a lot of support, I think, because it's easy to just say, we're going to take these top 4 or top 5, and then we'll, run ranked choice voting in the general.
Now sorry, go ahead, Julie.
Can I just add something about that? I think that if we were doing ranked choice here in Ohio, that, it has the potential to tone down a lot of the us or them rhetoric that we hear from the political parties now. The villainizing of the demonizing of the other and the other side, because our state is about 46% Democrat, 54% Republican. That's not how our elections have turned out lately. So I just feel like, wow, if it were okay, I could possibly choose just my second choice of either party. The parties would have to start talking about issues, which would be sort of amazing.
So let me pose questions about some of the disadvantages of ranked choice voting. There's an audience member who would like to hear about what some of those are, and there are at least a couple that do deserve some pretty serious consideration. One is the notion that it's more complicated and that voters will resist it. And with respect to that, I think I'd in particular like to invite James to talk about the way in which Alaska itself came to this point and how it's being received as of now. A very different concern about ranked choice voting is that it is subject to strategic manipulation if voters do not, in fact, rank what are their genuine preferences. And so maybe, Lisa, you could think about that if you want. And Michael, I'm sure you're also able to offer both a fair characterization of that concern and what to say in response. But James, tell us how the potential complexities of the ranked choice process have been received in Alaska.
Sure. When the vote came up in 2020, the it was part of a larger voter initiative. This was a 3-part initiative, of which ranked choice voting and the open primary were only 2 parts. The third part was called the dark money disclosure part. The idea is that if you're a PAC and contributing to a candidate, you have to disclose your donors. So disclose the true source of the money that's going to the candidate. And that issue was the one that was advertised on and promoted and was popular. The other 2 components, the ones that actually deal with the top 4 primary and the ranked choice voting, were much less popular in polling and were not discussed as much. So there was an attitude among voters that I talked to that I like this dark money provision. I'm less certain about ranked choice voting, but I'm willing to go along with it in order to get the dark money provision. And so now campaigns, candidates, and especially now that there's this special US House race that is sooner than expected, are hurrying to educate voters, instruct voters. The Republican Party is endorsing a education campaign called Vote Red, Rank Red. And the idea being that they need to educate their voters to not just pick one candidate in ranked choice voting, but actually rank multiple candidates. Otherwise, they feel like they'll be disenfranchised or at a disadvantage in the ranked choice voting process.
Lisa?
Yeah, thanks. So there's a question about gaming the system. And I guess I'll give you, in a sense, not so much of a technical answer, which I will sort of leave to the political scientists. But instead what I'll say is that if we think of gaming an electoral system, if we understand that to mean finding ways for a candidate who's not majority preferred to nevertheless get elected, then in a sense, what ranked choice voting is doing is it's trying to harness attempts at gaming the system and expand those attempts so that everybody now can try to, in a sense, game the system. And I don't think that the way I just phrased it made a ton of sense, but let me try it again. So if everybody is encouraged to provide alternatives, and then the electoral system takes all of those alternatives and tries to incorporate everybody's preferences in this really expansive way, then in a sense what we're doing is we're sort of opening the playing field and saying everybody gets to try to game it in that way. Like, just say who you want or rank them. If it doesn't work out at the beginning, your vote still counts. And so in that sense, the goal here is try to ensure that the majority preferred candidate is elected even with all of these preferences going on. But here's the punchline. The question, though, is everyone going to be willing to play this game? I mean, it does take a lot of energy. There's a lot of information costs. Voters get exhausted. And so I think that the main concerns that I see with ranked choice voting is less about tactical voting, is less about sort of strategic nominations, and more what we've already been talking about, which is, are the voters going to be resistant to it in a way that undermines what it's trying to accomplish? And I don't think we know the answer to that.
So let me invite Michael to respond to those points. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think a few points. One is I do think that, generally speaking, when you're talking about strategic voting, ranked choice voting is one of the systems that is fairly robust and resistant to strategic voting compared to others. So obviously plurality, right, rife for strategic voting. So, you know, it has the virtue of not violating the later no harm principle. So, you know, if I rank a second choice or a third choice, that's not going to hurt my first choice. And there are different systems where that criterion can be violated, and that can cause all sorts of strategic incentives. Like, do I take someone who I don't think I prefer and actually put them last, even if I maybe like them second, because like I think putting them last would help my first, right? Ranked choice voting, sort of the traditional counting model where you eliminate the last and sort of roll your way up to the top, doesn't pose that problem, right? So that's one of the more common ones. Another strategic voting problem is bullet voting, where if you have more options, you still only use one. And it's not, you know, there's no sort of strategic incentive to bullet vote in ranked choice voting either. So that's a weakness you sometimes see in, I noticed a discussion of approval voting, which again, I think there's a lot of systems that are better than plurality. So this isn't to say a knock against approval voting, but that would be more susceptible to bullet voting, strategic incentives. And so this gets to James' point and Lisa's point about like ballot usage. I think part of this is education by the parties, education by organizations and states, civic society, right? That there is no benefit to just voting one in the ranked choice voting scenario, right? So I think increasingly you see people learning and sort of copying to the new dynamics that emerge. And so whereas an endorsing party might have said, here's my top choice, vote for this person, they'll now say, here's our suggested ranking, right? Like, here's our top 4 in this order who we would prefer. And we saw that in, say, like the Democratic primary in New York City, where you'd have labor organizations, unions saying, look, here's our first preference, but if you don't like, here's our second, here's our third. And so that helps fill a little bit of this informational gap where people who might have looked to friends, neighbors, organizations, media, a paper instead of endorsing one candidate can provide their model ranking and why, explain why they've done that model ranking. So that helps fill the gap a little bit in terms of this concern about underusage. The other response I would say to that is part of this is a little bit of a learning process. So I think we see for, say, like discussions of voter confusion or ballot usage, often the first time is sort of like the worst case scenario because people are still learning the system. And then you see a lot of that recover in future elections as people realize what the new norm is, what the new dynamics are. So obviously, like, folks will want to be paying attention to those figures, but those figures have also sometimes been shown to improve over time. And ballot usage overall across, I think it's like the 500 something-ish US races we've had to date are pretty good in terms of ballot usage. I can pull up a stat here, but it's not at the tip of my tongue. But.
Well, so we are soon going to run out of time. One of the things that's clear to me, and I hope to everybody, is that there are a range of choices as to how we go about conducting democratic elections. And it's not simply the case that the conventional way we do it is necessarily the right or the only way to do it. But thinking about which way we really would ideally like to run elections is a complicated question to think about. On that one point quickly, Michael, are there states that have been themselves really seriously considering approval voting? I know there are some cities that have. Are there any states that have been thinking of approval voting?
I don't off the top of my head.
Okay.
No, I do. Again, I do know that there are some cities that have used approval voting, have been considering approval voting, but I haven't seen as much in terms of state level. So
I wanted to myself respond to one remaining question and then just see whether anybody else has a final thought you'd like to make in the time that's left. But the one question I wanted to respond to is a question that asks, isn't it a sort of mischaracterization that ranked choice voting prevents someone from being the candidate without a majority? Because in fact, you end up with a third or fourth place choice being selected, and that doesn't seem like they're a majority preference. But I wanted to sort of respond to that or push back against that a little bit with what I hope is a relatively simple example, and we'll stay in Ohio. We can imagine in Ohio that in the general election we may see J.D. Vance going up against Tim Ryan. And there may be a third candidate or more on that ballot, and it may be that none of those candidates get a majority, and so we end up with a plurality winner. But maybe we don't. Maybe we have a majority winner in that general election, but that majority winner in that general election that I just hypothesized may well not be the person that the state as a whole would really have desired if we had a different structure. And I'll give you this hypothetical. Imagine that we have Rob Portman also running in the fall, so that we have J.D. Vance, Tim Ryan, and Rob Portman on the ballot. It's not at all difficult to imagine that the way those votes come in a plurality-based system is that J.D. Vance, as the Republican nominee, has 45% of the vote, and that Tim Ryan has 30% of the vote, and that Rob Portman, running as an independent, has 25% of the vote. So he doesn't run this race, and he's not on the ballot. But if you use ranked choice voting in that hypothetical election, it could well be that Rob Portman is everybody's second choice. and he wins if we require a majoritarian outcome. It doesn't mean that we are selecting somebody who doesn't have majority support. It means we're selecting somebody who has a majority support once we've eliminated candidates who don't have majority support. So anyway, we're about out of time. Final thoughts from Julie? Start with you.
Yes, I just want to say that in the cities in Ohio that tried this over the decades, it did reveal more representation for Black and female candidates, which is another aspect for another day, but it's worth thinking about.
James?
I think one of the things I'm going to be watching this year is to see how the parties behave. Will the Democratic Party, for example, choose not to run a serious candidate or any candidate at all in the US Senate race in order to throw more support behind Lisa Murkowski, who is their preference over Kelly Tshibaka?
As is happening in the Utah US Senate seat right now. Thanks. Michael?
Yeah, so quickly to pick up on your point about, people being uncomfortable with come from behind winners, say a second place winner coming back to win first. I would say that the question is that person really a second choice, or is it just that's because of plurality elections show that we've had vote splitting, and so that person ends up in second choice, right? And so RCV allows us to get rid of that problem, that vote splitting problem, and potentially address that by saying, actually, this person was supported by the majority of voters when it came down to it. And I would also indicate, Julie raised this, and I think it's a great point, which is Ohio actually was a leader in ranked choice voting, as well as the multi-member version of that, proportional ranked choice voting, back in the 20s and 30s. And so it would be exciting to see Ohio take charge on that again.
Lisa?
Yeah, I think I just say that the more conversations we have like this, I think the better. There are a lot of challenges that are the electoral systems in the United States are facing right now. And the more that people are recognizing these issues and thinking through them and caring about the outcomes, those are sort of some of the most effective ways of responding to those challenges that we have. So again, the more discussions we have like this, the better.
Well, we will have more. In fact, one of the things that we didn't have any time today to talk about is something we here at Ohio State are quite eagerly considering, which is round robin style tournament voting, and as a particular way of using a ranked choice ballot. And we're out of time to do that today, so stay tuned. We'll find other opportunities to continue the discussion, as Lisa said. We really want to thank all four of you for being a part of this today, and many thanks to Jillian Thompson for many of the logistics, and for the audience who's with us. And we hope you have a great rest of this day, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in some future events. So thank you, everyone.